Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Tuesday morning. If you are here for the Fair Housing 101 training for rental professionals, you are in the right place. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. A few housekeeping things before we get started. All of your audio, all attendees' audio is muted and your cameras are turned off, so we cannot see or hear you. The best way to communicate with us is through the chat. However, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. If there are questions in the chat, they will most likely be missed because we use the Q&A feature to look for questions. So please use the Q&A feature for questions. This session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube. We will have a short break halfway through the presentation. Additionally, for those that need to verify your attendance, we will be providing an evaluation at the end of the training. It also should be open in your browser after you close this. That needs to be completed by tomorrow by 5 p.m. You will receive an email verifying your attendance. We are no longer providing physical certificates. We will be sending them via email. So please complete that evaluation by 5 p.m. tomorrow. Otherwise, we will not be able to send you an email verifying your attendance. And then that is it for the housekeeping. Today presenting will be myself, Brianna Miranda. I am an education outreach coordinator, and joining me additionally is Lindsay Owens. They will also be presenting. And then on the back end, we have Liz Keegan, the Director of Education and Outreach, who is doing some technical assistance. So if you have colleagues who are having issues getting on, feel free to have them reach out to Liz. And then there's just our general contact information. And then we want to do a big thank you to Mishta, who is allowing us to provide this training free of charge to all of you. So this training is sponsored by Mishta. And then just to go through what we'll be talking about today, introducing who we are, what housing discrimination is, what fair housing laws are, going into the protected characteristics, how do we apply those, the application of the laws, going over what testing is, the equal housing opportunity logo, and then we'll do questions and then conclude from there. So we're going to start off with a poll just to get an idea of where everyone is. This is a 101, so we are, taking it slow, but just getting an idea. So we're going to ask first, on a scale of 1 to 5, please rate your level of familiarity with fair housing. A poll should have opened up. If you're using the browser, I do know there's some issues with doing polls that way. So it's okay if you can't use the polls if they did not pop up. But if you can, please answer to let us know kind of where you are in the familiarity of fair housing. I'll give about 30 more seconds here. So 1 is being new, 3 is some, and then 5 is you know a lot. All right, get your answers in. I'm going to end the poll here and then share the results. So we have quite on the higher end of having some fair housing knowledge. So thank you for joining us if you've attended one of our 101s before. And thanks to all of you that are new here and just learning along with us. The next poll we're going to be doing is kind of just an overview of what the protected characteristics are. So check all of the protected characteristics under federal fair housing laws: smokers, race, religion, sex, credit history, national origin, convicted felon, disability, adult with dependent children, and color. And it is multiple choice. Give about another 30 seconds to get your answers in. And then if you're attending with a group today, you kind of just have to come to a consensus, and then none of the polls are graded. It's really just to have engagement and kind of testing everyone's knowledge. Alrighty. See a few people with answers piling in. Get your last minute answers in, and then I'm going to share the results. Okay, so the all the federal protected characteristics, which we will go over, but for this answer, we have race, religion, sex, national origin, disability, adult with dependent children, and color. So the only ones that are not protected are smokers, credit history, and convicted felon. So all the others are protected characteristics. So good job on that. Majority of you got those. And then we have one more that contains three, and they're true and false questions. The first one, anyone can file a fair housing complaint, a resident, a visitor, or a property manager, true or false. The second one, maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for a certain type of tenant under fair housing laws, true or false. And then the third one, a property manager has the right to inquire about whether opposite sex children under the age of 18 will have separate bedrooms, true or false. There's a few questions here, so I'll give folks about 45 seconds to a minute.
Bree, you are muted.
Thank you. I took a drink of water. Thank you. Anyone can file a fair housing complaint, a resident, a visitor, a property manager. That I agree with 96% of you. That is true. That anyone has the right to file a fair housing complaint. The second one, maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for a certain type of tenant under fair housing laws. I agree with 81% of you. That is false. Anyone can be held responsible for stating a preference. Any employees, I should say, of the housing can be responsible for stating a preference. And then the last one, a property manager has the right to inquire about whether opposite sex children under the age of 18 will have separate bedrooms. This is also false. This has ties to familial status discrimination. As a property manager, your duty stops at knowing how many tenants are in the unit. Okay, so thank you all for indulging those first quizzes to get us started this morning. And then I'm going to pass it off to Lindsay, who will kind of go into who we are at the Fair Housing Center.
Hey everyone, good morning. Like Bree said, I'm going to talk about Fair Housing Center West Michigan. Then we'll move into giving a bit of a background on fair housing laws. And then we will move on to discussing more of the protected characteristics and in different applicable ways that the law might impact some of the work that you all do. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A feature, especially if they're questions related to some of the content. I think we'll try and answer some of them throughout if we're seeing a lot of questions in a particular section. And we will also have time at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. Okay. So the Fair Housing Center West Michigan, or FHCWM, is a private nonprofit fair housing organization founded in 1980. Our mission is to ensure fair housing choice and equal access to housing opportunities for all people in our communities. We work towards this mission by providing comprehensive fair housing services. So things like education, what we're doing today, helping inform you all about fair housing laws and your responsibilities under them. We also do outreach in our communities, research, advocacy, and enforcement around fair housing. Core to our work is the understanding that where you live impacts how you live. And so the ability to choose housing free from experiencing illegal discrimination is really important. We, as an organization, really try to lead with education wherever possible to prevent housing discrimination. So, helping housing providers understand what their responsibilities are. We really try to lead with education as an organization. We do want to note a few disclaimers. We're not an enforcement authority. We are not a government agency. We receive government funds and grants to do some of our services, but we are not a government agency or an enforcement authority. We don't have practicing attorneys on staff, so the information provided today is only for educational purposes, current to the best of our knowledge, but it's not legal advice. So if you need legal advice about particular situations that you're experiencing, you really need to consult an attorney. And then just want to note here, we discussed it during the poll, but anyone can report housing discrimination. This includes housing providers. So if you're seeing housing discrimination happening at your organizations, you can report it as well. Just want to touch a bit more on our education work. We really strive to provide education to all people in our communities, including the housing industry, people who are seeking homes, whether that's buying or renting homes, and then the general public. We really believe that educating the housing industry is important. We're providing guidance and education that can help stop discrimination before it happens. We really rely heavily on self-policing and industry commitment to fair housing efforts. Without this cooperation with the housing industry, we would not be able to accomplish our mission. We also believe it's really important that home seekers and the general public have an understanding of their rights when seeking housing. The more people understand their rights, they can recognize when discrimination might be happening and report it. Enforcement is another kind of facet of our work. It involves taking in complaints of housing discrimination, investigating complaints, analyzing information, and if warranted, working towards a resolution. Really, ideally, enforcement would not be is not something that we want to do. But sometimes the laws and education aren't always enough to make sure that everyone in our communities has an equal opportunity to housing. The words fair housing in our name can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And sometimes people in our communities are confused about the work that we do as an organization. Our focus is really around fair housing laws at the federal, state, and local levels. We will talk a bit more about exactly what fair housing is in the next section, but typically fair housing has to do with housing discrimination. So to help clarify, these are some things as an organization that we do not do or we don't strictly do. So at the Fair Housing Center, West Michigan, we do not address landlord or tenant law or matters. We don't teach home buyer classes or credit counseling. We don't work strictly on affordable housing issues, although we do work in some of those areas. We don't handle building code and maintenance issues unless they're related to housing discrimination. We don't do foreclosure prevention, and we do not offer or refer housing. So this is a list of things that we do not do as an organization. Our focus is really around fair housing and housing discrimination. Our organization receives funding through different sources, including city, county, state, and federal governments to provide fair housing services like education and enforcement. We also bring in funding through our annual membership drive. If you're interested in becoming a member, we'll have more information towards the end of this presentation. But our members really help us support the work that we're doing um, at our organization. We also bring in money through different events like the annual Fair Housing Workshop Series. Some of you may have been able to attend that in April. That's when it typically happens. We also provide consulting and training around fair housing, do special projects, and receive some funding through senior millages in our service area. And then this is kind of a map of the different fair housing centers in Michigan. So there are, I think, 4/5 different organizations that are doing fair housing work in our state. You'll notice that we are the Fair Housing Center in West Michigan, so we are in a teal color covering all the way over to Holland and Ottawa County, up to Traverse City, and then the entire Upper Peninsula. All of these fair housing centers are independent from one another, but we do similar work, and we have a close relationship with one another. So if um, say you are attending this training, but you're a housing provider in Detroit, if you contact us with questions, we will likely kindly refer you over to people in Detroit who can really answer more questions about what local laws and protections might look like in your area, because we are really focused on our area in West Michigan. So feel free to refer to this. You should have received map of the different fair housing centers in Michigan in the handouts. If you haven't received the handouts, I know that Liz has been putting the link to the handouts on our website. So feel free to reference those too. Okay, we have covered the section about our organization. Do we have any pending questions focused on that section? Let me see. I think there's a question that says someone is based in Southwest Michigan. Does all of this still apply? The federal and state protections likely would apply, but there may be some differences in local protections based on where you're living exactly. So if you have questions about what protections might apply to you, the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan might be a great place to ask about some of those local protections. But the Michigan protections and federal protections should still apply, and we'll talk a bit about that today. Okay, we will move on to a discussion of fair housing. It seems like a lot of you are familiar, so this might be review, but there may also be some people who this might be new for. So we will just cover it all. So fair housing law is the right of individuals to obtain housing of their choice free from discrimination based on protected characteristics under federal, state, and local fair housing laws. Fair housing protects against discrimination in any housing transaction. So this includes things like renting, sales, lending, insurance, and more. These are the list of protected characteristics under federal, state, and local laws. At the federal level, race, color, religion, sex, disability status, familial status, and national origin are protected. In case you all don't know, skin color refers to color. Disability status includes any mental or physical disabilities. Familial status is defined as the presence of children under the age of 18 in your home or pregnancy. And national origin is where you or your family are from. And then in addition to federally protected characteristics, Michigan laws include all of the federally protected characteristics under our state laws. They also include an expanded definition of race to include traits historically associated with race, such as hair texture, protective hairstyles. The state of Michigan also has protections for age. There are some exceptions for senior housing. I think we will cover that in a bit. Michigan also has protections for sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, marital status, and then new as of April of 2025, Michigan added source of income protections in rental housing. So we'll discuss all of these in more depth in the coming hours of this training. Then locally in West Michigan and across Michigan, protections really vary based on the municipality you live in. So in some later slides, we'll talk about some local protections in our region in West Michigan. But if you're interested in learning more about protections in municipalities where your properties might be located, Municode and American Legal are really great resources. I've used them in the past to look for what protections might be applicable in different municipalities. So they're a really great resource. And of course, if you have questions about protections in our West Michigan service area, please feel free to contact us. And if you have questions about other service areas, we will be able to refer you out to fair housing centers who can answer those questions in greater detail. One really important aspect of fair housing laws and housing discrimination, of understanding this concept, is the idea of differences in treatment. So fair housing laws require that each person is treated in an equal way in a housing transaction, regardless of a protected characteristic. It's illegal for someone to be treated differently in a housing transaction because of a protected characteristic. So when people call us, our intake line, we're really looking to see, is there a difference in treatment because of a protected characteristic? And that's where it really becomes applicable to the fair housing side of things. When I use the term housing transaction, that fair housing laws cover all housing transactions, that can sound pretty broad. So this is how I tend to think of it. Housing transactions are activities that take place in the housing arena, including things like advertising, eligibility criteria, applications, documents, processes, policies, terms, conditions, discount specials, maintenance, and access to housing amenities. It's illegal under fair housing laws for people to be treated differently because of a protected characteristic in these things, like advertising, eligibility criteria. This also includes steering. So some of you may know what steering is. It means guiding people towards certain housing opportunities instead of others because of a protected characteristic. And then harassment, which can look like intimidation or sexual harassment, is also illegal. So steering and harassment are illegal under the Fair Housing Act. And then when we think about what types of housing are covered, it's a lot of housing. Apartments, whether they're leased or rented, houses or condos, whether they're sold, leased, or rented, housing construction sites, even empty lots intended to be used for housing are protected. Homeowners associations, condo associations, mobile or manufactured housing, insurance, transitional housing and homeless shelters, college dorms, student housing, cooperatives, nursing homes, independent living communities, even extended stay hotels used as a residence. So likely, if you have housing, it's probably covered under fair housing laws. And then just want to discuss some of the trends that we're seeing in fair housing. According to the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is a national fair housing advocacy organization, in 2024, there were 32,321 fair housing complaints received by private nonprofit fair housing organizations, federal and state agencies. This is a drop from 2023. However, there were a 5% drop in agencies available to receive complaints. This is the most recent data we have, but I am really interested in what the next report will be. It should drop maybe sometime in the next few months, in the summer months. Nationally, the highest number of cases was really based on disability status at 55% of all housing discrimination cases. Race is the second largest at 16%. And then our local fair housing trends really do mirror the national fair housing trends in a lot of ways. So our organization received a total of 265 fair housing allegations and managed 284 cases in 2025. our top areas of allegations were really based on disability status, race and color, and source of income. And then in 2025, the largest number of allegations that our organization received by transaction type came through the rental market at 50%. There could be a lot of reasons for this. A likely reason is that the rental market moves pretty quickly, and people are moving in and out of it more often. So there's more opportunities for discrimination to happen when people are moving in and out of housing quickly. But there could be a variety of other reasons for this. The next largest number of allegations by transaction was related to disability-related accommodations or modifications, and then harassment or retaliation. So it's really important seeing these numbers, about 50% of our transactions taking place, or 50% of our allegations by transaction type taking place in the rental market. It's really important that rental professionals get fair housing education and training. Bridging from our last slide, why should this matter to rental professionals? So given what we've covered about fair housing, why should it matter to people in the housing industry? So there's a lot of different reasons. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we know that many of the people who are on this training today recognize and hold similar values to our Fair Housing Center West Michigan, the importance of equal housing opportunity, and that no one should face illegal housing discrimination. But aside from those motivations and values, housing discrimination has negative impacts on our communities as a whole. Discrimination in housing often limits our ability to get housing for particular protected groups. And so this unnecessarily limits the market for housing and can create detrimental economic impacts on our entire community, because we know that what happens to individuals can impact all of us in our community. Another reason why housing industry members should care is fair housing is also the law. It's the law at the federal level, and then we have state and local laws as well. So discrimination based on protected characteristics under federal, state, and local laws is illegal. A housing industry professional's or provider's intention to discriminate is not required to be found liable for illegal discrimination. So you can, someone could maybe, a housing provider could not intend to discriminate, but they are discriminating. And that would not be a good defense for not being liable for illegal discrimination. The other thing is ignorance is not a good defense for violating fair housing laws. So rental professionals in our state are not required to get fair housing education, although it is a very, very, very good idea and a good practice as an industry to get regular fair housing education, because ignorance isn't going to be a good defense for violating fair housing laws. Okay, I'll see if there's some questions before we move on to a little bit of a more in-depth review. Looks like we have a source of income question that we can cover a little bit later when we get to source of income. Okay. So now that we've discussed kind of a brief overview of fair housing laws, discussed our organization, we are going to talk about some of the background behind the Federal Fair Housing Act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era and was the first Civil Rights Act in the United States. This act established that all people born in the United States, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, were entitled to the basic rights of citizenship. Specific rights include the right to purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. Then the Civil Rights Act of 1870 prohibited discrimination by state officials in voter registration based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These Reconstruction Acts were a start to protections for race in housing. So these are some of the first civil rights laws that we had in our country. Under the Reconstruction Act, something we want to make clear is that discrimination based on race was absolutely prohibited. Unfortunately, the enforcement of these Reconstruction Acts were really weak, eventually leading to the passing of more laws guaranteeing civil rights in our country. So we are going to take a moment to watch a video about the lead up to the Fair Housing Rights Act. This video was produced by Nationwide in honor of the National Fair Housing Alliance's 30th anniversary.
Few in the nation believe that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President? Yes, Dick. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here because it was a white community.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they're allowed to move in here in any number.
It seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, a right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it. And we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
For your presence, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take my, you take our hand.
The death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are for all time. The Martin Luther Kings come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
Fight still goes on because we unfortunately have the laws, but we don't have the enforcement. That we have changed, but we still have the same kinds of discrimination.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said today that efforts by federal agencies to end housing discrimination have been generally superficial or incomplete.
President Carter has ordered federal agencies to use all means possible to strengthen fair housing programs.
For the first time, people with disabilities and families with children will be protected from housing discrimination.
President Reagan signed legislation today designed to toughen up the nation's fair housing laws.
Why did you take part in this demonstration today? Just because there was a huge crowd, or did you have any personal reason?
Well, I took part in this march today because of Martin Luther King and what he stood for, because this march is what he died for.
You know what he stood for?
Yes. He stood for nonviolence and peace for all men of all kinds. And I think if he died for it, I could carry out what he started.
Okay, so we hope you enjoyed that video. It's a nice break from us talking to you all, but we will get back into the presentation to discuss a bit more about our fair housing laws. So as the video detailed, 7 days after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which includes the Fair Housing Act, was passed. This act did not change protections for race under the Reconstruction Acts, but it did help bolster protections across the United States in housing. So at the time it was passed, the Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. It made it unlawful to make, print, or publish any notice, statement, or advertising of the sale or rental of housing that indicates any preference, limitation, or discrimination based on these protected characteristics at the time. So race, color, religion, and national origin. Then in 1974, the act was amended to add sex as a protected characteristic. And then in 1988, it was amended again to add disability status and familial status as protected characteristics. So again, this is the Federal Fair Housing Act under the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And this, by 1988, all 7 of the federally protected classes have been added. Then in Michigan, a state law was enacted similar to the Federal Fair Housing Act to include all the federally protected characteristics. In Michigan, we also have the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, or ELCRA, of 1976. ELCRA extends protections to include marital status, age, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and source of income in rental housing. It also includes an expanded definition of race that we'll talk about more about in the coming slides. Additionally, in Michigan, we have the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act of 1976. It has it's similar to federal disability protections and puts a greater burden on landlords in the state to make reasonable accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities. In 2023, Michigan expanded the definition of race under ELCRA, or the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, through the Crown Act, which stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. The Crown Act defines race to include traits historically associated with race, including but not limited to hair texture and protective hairstyles. The Crown Act really emerged from wanting to have protections in education, but a lot of our protected characteristics extend to more than just housing. They may extend to things like education, the medical industry, stuff like that. But that expanded definition of race does apply to housing. Then in 2023, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act was amended to add sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as protected characteristics. In 2024, these protections went into effect in Michigan. In 2025, source of income in rental housing protections went into place in Michigan. Source of income includes benefit or subsidy programs, including housing assistance, housing choice vouchers, public assistance, veterans benefits, Social Security, supplemental security income, or other programs administered by any federal, state, local, or nonprofit entity. Landlords are still allowed to require a certain amount of income to rent a unit, but they can't specify the source of that income. There are some notes that one source of income needs to be legal and ongoing, and source of income wouldn't include income derived in an illegal manner. There is an exemption for small landlords with fewer than 5 units in the state of Michigan. And there's a note that housing agencies tasked with handling vouchers need to approve applications within 30 days. This is all a really brief overview of source of income. We will talk a lot more about it in more depth later in this presentation. That's just a little bit of a snippet of source of income protections added since April of 2025 is when those protections went into place. There are exemptions to some fair housing laws if an owner or a member of the owner's immediate family resides in one unit in a duplex, and that is the only property they own. Regardless of exemptions, all housing providers, including landlords, are prohibited from advertising or making statements in a discriminatory manner. We will talk a bit more about advertising in the next section. But just want to make this note about exemptions. If you have questions about this in the future, please feel free to reach out to us. But do note that no one is prohibited from advertising or making statements in a discriminatory manner. We want to list some of the local protections in the West Michigan area, and then we have a few that are outside of West Michigan to give examples. So in the Grand Rapids area, that's where our center's office is located, and we're in Grand Rapids. We have a variety of different protections based on where properties are located. So genotype is protected in Grand Rapids. That's kind of like someone's genetic makeup or DNA. Height and weight are protected in East Grand Rapids, Kentwood, and Wyoming. And then medical condition is protected in Grand Rapids. Again, like I said a few slides ago, some of these protections might extend to more than just housing, but they're just things to keep aware of that they do apply to housing. Some of the protections along the lakeshore, we have education as a protection in the city of Holland, and then height and weight as protections in Muskegon Heights. Up in Traverse City, height and weight are additional protections up there. And not in our service area, but as a good example of a range of protected characteristics that a municipality might have. Ann Arbor has protections for arrest record, educational association, family responsibilities, genetic information, height, HIV status, political beliefs, veteran status, victim of domestic violence, stalking, and weight. These are some of those protections in Ann Arbor. If someone were to own housing that's right outside of the city boundary of Ann Arbor, some of these protections might not apply if they're not protected in that other municipality. If you have more detailed questions about some of these protections, reaching out to the Fair Housing Center of South, East, and Mid-Michigan would be a great resource. And then in Kalamazoo, which is also not in our service area, that would be the Southwest Michigan Fair Housing Center area. Educational affiliation, status as a victim of domestic violence, personal identification method, prior arrest, and conviction record are all local protections in Kalamazoo. Because additional protections can vary so much by municipality, as we've demonstrated in previous slides, it's a housing provider's job to be aware of what protections apply to each of their properties. You can learn more by contacting us, by checking some of these resources, Municode and American Legal, by reaching out to your local municipality, or by contacting your local fair housing center. Something we've seen emerging across our state are ordinances focused on protections for people with criminal records. We don't have any of those protections in our West Michigan service area, but there are these protections in other areas like Ann Arbor, Detroit, Jackson, and Kalamazoo. There's also been legislation that's been proposed in the Michigan legislature several times. If that legislation passed, it would prohibit a landlord from considering an applicant's criminal history during the tenant screening process. So this is just something to be aware of, that some of these ordinances are being passed at the local level in different municipalities, and someday it may pass in the Michigan legislature and apply to Michigan statewide. Okay, I'm going to launch a quick poll. Sorry, one moment. Okay. Gonna launch this poll. If you're not seeing the polls pop up on your screen, you can feel free to answer to yourself or answer in the chat. But the poll is, do you know if your property receives any federal funding? Yes, no, I'm not sure. This will be really helpful for the next part of our presentation, where we do talk about laws. Oh, I see. Okay, the poll should be launching now. Okay, sorry, the poll had a problem launching, but The answer to this question will apply to some of the protections we talk about in the coming slides. If you're not sure if your property receives any federal funding, it would be really helpful for you in the future to make sure that you get an answer to that question because there may be extra expectations on properties that receive federal funding, and you should really be aware of those. So if you don't know today, that shouldn't be a problem, but you probably want to figure out that answer sometime soon. Okay, I'll give a few more seconds for people to answer, and then we'll all together. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. And the results should be sharing with you all. A lot of you said yes, you do receive federal funding. Quite a few of you said no, and then quite a few of you said I'm not sure. So if you're not sure, again, make sure you figure out the answer to that question, because that'll be really helpful for the future. Not sure what's happening with the polls today, but okay, we will move on to our next section. Also note about the polls is they're not required. They're just a way to engage with you all since we can't hear you or see you. We just want to have some activities to hear feedback from you all. But if you can't participate in them, they're not required. So don't feel like you are missing something really important if you're not able to answer the polls. Okay, so the reason why we asked you whether your properties, if they receive federal funding or not, is because some protections apply to properties that are federally funded. So one of those is the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. It provides specific protections for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Also want to note that domestic violence cases have been successfully filed under the gender protections or sex protections of the Fair Housing Act. VAWA applies to properties that are federally subsidized or properties that receive federal funding. Under VAWA, victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking cannot be denied admission or federal rental assistance just because they're a victim or a threatened victim. They cannot be evicted or lose federal rental assistance just because they have been a victim or a threatened victim. And they can't be denied admission or rental assistance, evicted, or lose their subsidy for reasons relating to abuse, such as bad credit history or criminal history. VAWA applies to those who are applying for or are tenants in any of these programs. So public housing, Section 8 housing choice voucher programs, Section 8 project-based housing, Section 202 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for the disabled, Section 236 multifamily rental housing, and a whole list, continuum of care programs, home investment partnerships, HOPWA or housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, McKinney-Vento Act homeless programs, and LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit housing. VAWA requires that communities honor abuse protection orders and other court orders that address access to or control of the unit. VAWA requires that communities inform individuals of their rights under VAWA and include that info in lease agreements. In cases where both the victim and the perpetrator are parties to a lease, VAWA permits the community to bifurcate the lease to evict the perpetrator and allow the victim to remain housed. Linked here, we have Mishra's webpage on VAWA if you want to do some more research into this, because this is a pretty brief overview of VAWA. Regardless of whether a property receives federal funding, the following are some things that housing providers should do or should not do relating to domestic violence. They should not deny admission based on an individual's status as a domestic violence victim. They shouldn't evict a domestic violence victim based on an incident of actual or threatened violence. They should not terminate a lease based on criminal activity directly relating to domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking, unless the community can demonstrate an actual or imminent threat to other tenants or those employed at or providing services to the property if the lease was not terminated. Housing providers can assist victims of domestic violence by making sure their properties are well lit, safe, and secure, completing repairs that pose safety issues in a timely manner, acknowledging domestic violence protection orders and helping enforce them, excluding the violent person from the premises, assisting in pressing of criminal charges, not publishing victims' addresses in newsletters or giving out information to anyone without a release from the tenant, and recognizing that domestic violence is not a lease violation. Some other laws to be aware of, especially for those receiving federally funding or who are federally subsidized, are Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, Title VI, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and Housing for Older Persons Act, or HOPA. Section 504 is a law that protects qualified individuals from discrimination based on their disability. Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act is a federal law that prohibits creditors from discriminating against an applicant because of their race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, age, or because they receive public assistance, or because an applicant exercised good faith, their rights under good faith under the Consumer Credit Protection Act. And then HOPA, or Housing for Older Persons Act, has specifications that housing must meet in order to be qualified as senior housing. So these are some other laws to be aware of. And if you have future questions about them, feel free to contact us. Lastly, we want to note that only the groups specifically listed under federal, state, and local fair housing laws enjoy protections under the law. So other characteristics that are not protected in our service area, for example, include bad credit, past criminal history, and tattoos. These are not protected in any of our local municipalities to the best of our knowledge, but they could be protected in other areas and they could be protected in the future. So we just want to note that the protections, there are not other protections for groups that are not protected by being written into our fair housing laws at the federal, state, and local levels. Okay, we are going to move on to advertising. I will throw it over to Bree to continue with this section.
Thanks, Lindsay. Okay, to start our advertising section, we do have a poll, so fingers crossed that it'll work. If you go to the next slide, please. All right, this is going to be a true or false. Let's see, it's taking a moment to launch, so there may be issues with the Zoom polls today, so apologies on that. So I am going to ask the question and maybe it'll launch. A newspaper or online ad that describes the type of person a landlord wants to rent to is acceptable under fair housing laws. True or false? A newspaper or online ad that describes the type of person a landlord wants to rent to is acceptable under fair housing laws. I'll give folks, I know as people are putting in their answers in the chat, which I truly appreciate. Thank you for working with us here as Zoom likes to not work, apparently. Once the chat slows down a little bit, I will reveal the answer. since it's still not launching. Okay. I think we're slowing down on our answers now. Okay. A newspaper or online ad that describes the type of person a landlord wants to rent to is acceptable under fair housing laws. That is false. So I did see a lot of false answers coming in. So thank you for that. You never want to describe the type of people that you want in your housing. That really opens you up to fair housing risk. Slide. Okay, so discriminatory advertising is prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. It is stated that it is unlawful to make, print, or publish, or cause to be made, printed, or published any notice, statement, or advertisement with respect to the sale that indicates the preference or limitation based on race, color, religion, national origin, or an intention to make such preference, limitation, or discrimination. So it is pretty broad, what advertising is considered. So it does include the promotional materials, but it also includes any verbal statements made. So advertising is also the verbal statements that you make to potential tenants. So just keep that in mind also as you're going about business. Next slide. So anytime statements that are describing the type of people that you want in your housing, it really just opens you up to fair housing risk. So some potential statements that we've seen, this home would be ideal for an elderly couple. There is some familial status, risk there, as well as perfect for one adult. Ideal for two singles or a married couple. These are all have very heavily familial status risk here because it's really showing that you don't want families with children and you only want certain types of couples that also would be marital status. So there's a lot of risk here with all of these statements. Next slide. These next ones also ideal for a college student or a single person. The last one, you must be clean, no drugs, no criminal history. If you feel you qualify, please respond with your brief description about yourself, race, and age, and a recent picture of you. This is a really alarming type of statement made, and I believe this did come from a case that did, go through, and the person was discriminating against people based on race in their housing. So a lot of fair housing risk when you're describing the people and not the property. Targeted advertising carries a lot of fair housing risk as well. In many ways, you're denying different people different information about housing opportunities, targeting vulnerable people, consumers for predatory products or services, could be discouraging or deterring potential consumers. You could be steering folks to different areas or charging advertisers higher amounts to show ads to some consumers. So again, that difference of treatment based on a protected characteristic opens you up to fair housing risk. It just removes choice when you are targeting advertising. Next slide. New technologies can be really great, and they have, I know for a lot of folks, made advertising easier. However, there are some downfalls. When you use targeting advertising, you open up risk because you're targeting the housing towards some people and away from others. So an example would be targeting rental ads to predominantly Black neighborhoods that include notices of no criminal records and good credit only, while ads in white neighborhoods don't have that language. So it's again that difference of information also given based on characteristics. Another example would be targeting mortgage ads for men that has detailed information on current rates, but the ad for women says getting a mortgage is easy. So targeting advertising can make it really easy. You're reaching groups of people maybe that you want living in your community. But again, if you're targeting them based on a protected characteristic, you're really opening yourself up for a fair housing issue. Next slide. This is a really interesting advertisement. It doesn't really make sense, but if you read over this advertisement, really talking about the type of smells in the community, which can be really closely related to national origin. Um, Really not, if you read over this, it really doesn't tell you types about the housing. You don't know how many bedrooms they are. You don't know if they, utilities are included. Gives you no information about the housing that you're seeking. So there is a lot of risk with the phrases and words that are in them, but again, just not a good business strategy to not, get people to want to live at your space. So when thinking about advertising, it's important to focus on the property rather than the people. Next slide. And then just reviewing your advertising while using human models in advertising. Housing providers should focus on the models that represent a diversity of people and groups. If your human models only reflect certain groups, it may discourage people from applying or believing that they could live there. If you are going to use human models, it should represent everyone in your community, all different races, all different genders and sexes, and people with different abilities. So, look at if you're going to use human models, make sure you're looking at all the protected characteristics and making sure somebody is represented in that. Non-representative advertisements open up a housing provider to fair housing risk. And then this is kind of just a, I don't say scale, but a way to kind of assess your risk of using human models. So the best practice, best method is just using no human models. I understand that in the marketing world, that is not ideal because I know there is some psychology with seeing human faces and things like that. But if you're focusing on fair housing risk, no human models really is the best way. You really should be focusing on rooms, units, features, amenities, ambiance, services, etc. As a renter myself, I really care more about those things anyways. So when I'm looking at for housing, I'm not focusing on the people because I really want to know what kind of units they have and if they, what amenities they have. Then there is some risk when 100% of the residents are depicted as white with, some Black, Latino, or Asian staff. This really has a selective representation, so it does open you up to risk. And then the highest risk on the level is if you're showing all staff and residents as being white. So it's one particular protected characteristic that just opens you up to risk. Next slide, please. So these are just some examples of effective advertising, just showing different groups of families and abilities and things like that. Next slide. Many federal or state-funded insured or assisted housing programs in Michigan have an obligation to create and implement an affirmatively fair housing marketing plan, or AFHMP. This is really important. Why we asked earlier when the polls stopped working, or if your property receives any federal funding or state funding. This is important because if you do, then you need to make sure that you have an affirmative fair housing marketing plan. MSHDA requires that a plan is maintained and improved on-site. A marketing plan is a strategy designed to attract your buyers and sellers of all majority and minority groups, and it's regardless of protected characteristics. This really assists in making sure that they're being marketed well. And then there's a link there for MSHDA's instructions if you are interested in learning more. Next slide. So there are some, that's the next slide. Affirmative fair housing marketing plans need to be targeting. They need to be thinking about different populations that are least eligible to apply. And then creating an outreach plan that outlines different measures to attract those groups. And then indicators, how success will be measured. How are you planning to measure if you're reaching those people or not? Staff training, demonstrating that you're providing fair housing training and following the fair housing laws objectives. The plans do need to be reviewed at least every 5 years, or when the local community development consolidated plan is updated, or when there's significant changes in the demographics of the project or the local housing market. So there is some work that needs to be done on this end when you're creating an affirmative marketing plan, fair housing marketing plan. Such a mouthful. Next slide, please. So these are some kind of common plan mistakes. There can be some incomplete information. So maybe the number of units or the price of the units or marketing area is not provided at all. Insufficient research. You're not considering all ethnic groups when thinking about the plan and who's least likely to apply. Failure to advertise in those places used by people who have been deemed least likely to apply, lack of follow-up with community contacts to making sure it was been advertised, and then no standard to ensure the marketing plan was effective, and lack of current staff training on the fair housing laws. So again, when you're creating this plan, these are mistakes that you should be looking out for and kind of checking your box to make sure that you're hitting all of these things and not making these same mistakes. Next slide, please. Discounts and perks. So when is it okay to offer specials? Discounts and perks must be made available to everyone, regardless of protected characteristic. And discrimination under fair housing laws does include the provision of discounts, perks, conditions, and privileges. So, it would be illegal to charge higher costs for an African-American couple compared to a white couple, and it is illegal to charge families with children higher costs. So just make sure you are providing your discounts and perks to everyone, regardless of protected characteristic. Next slide, please. Be mindful some advertising best practices. Be mindful that for advertising under fair housing includes promotional materials, internet ads, newspaper ads, any physical types of materials, and verbal statements. Ensure that all your staff, residents, and applicants are equally aware of the applicable criteria, policies, and any rebates or specials. Throughout this whole thing, we're probably mentioned it a few times, but consistency is key to compliance. Consistently give the information to everyone really just saves you from any fair housing risk. Next slide, please. Some more best practices. Review all advertising materials for fair housing implications before publishing or posting. This is something, if you are located in our service area, we can help with depending on funding, but this, we truly try to make an effort to help folks review their advertising materials in a final form if you are concerned. But really, if you're in doubt, then just take it out and make sure you're describing the property, not the people. If you're seeing words for ideal for, that should be a cue to just take out that fragment of sentence and rework it to something else. Really just be focusing on the amenities, what the property is like. That will really not open you up to fair housing risk. And then the last one there, use the Equal Housing Opportunity logo. If you click on that link, it will take you to a place where you can download those different logos in different, sizes. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into screening. We're going to go through each of these bullet points throughout the slides, but for best practices for screening, establish relevant fair housing criteria, use only recent accurate records, follow your screening policy, consistency is key, be transparent with applicants, and allow applicants to challenge information. So for the first one there, go to the next slide, please. When you're establishing relevant fair housing criteria, make sure you're developing, documenting, and using clearly defined requirements. Example, minimum household income. Minimal household income is from all legal ongoing sources. So just again, it's clearly defined. Your requirements are clearly defined, both for your staff to understand, but also for applicants to understand. Focus on information that is tied to their likelihood of compliance of, being a tenant. Don't be focusing on information that really isn't relevant to them becoming a tenant. It just can always open you up to fair housing risk if you're asking for questions in screening or the application process that aren't really relevant to tenancy. Prioritize use of recent records, review your criteria regularly and document that review. So not only should you be developing it on the front end, but regularly reviewing it throughout your time. Set up a schedule, maybe it's every year, 6 months, whatever the case may be. Cross-reference your criteria with the list of protected characteristics. Kind of be thinking when you're looking at your criteria, would anyone be treated differently based on a protected characteristic if they were applying? So really just go down that list and kind of be putting yourself in that situation. Would anyone have a challenge or be treated differently with this screening criteria? Next slide, please. Use only recent accurate records. So something that has been shown, data has shown that screening data can be incomplete, outdated, and incorrect. Sometimes records with similar names may be erroneously attributed to the wrong person. So making sure that the records match multiple pieces of information. Don't use records with a positive outcome. So an example would be if there was an eviction filed against a tenant, but they prevailed, that should not be utilized within your when considering a tenant. If you're not clear with what happened, disregard it until you can get more information. Really be thinking about where is this data coming from? Is there any data cleanup undertaken? How and how often? Next slide, please. Follow your screening policy. This is, throughout anything that we teach you today, I hope you get that. Just follow your policies and make sure they're not discriminatory towards anyone. Do not request or require any information that falls outside of your policy. Doing so really opens you up. Why are you asking this person for this information, but not this person for this information? Don't consider records outside the scope of your stated policy. So if your policy only screens for felony convictions, then you should not be considering misdemeanors. Next slide, please. Be transparent with applicants. Again, make sure they're clearly written, but they're also publicly available for all applicants. Maybe they're on the website. Maybe you provide them, and when anyone tours, just making sure they're publicly available for everyone. Transparency is really important because that helps people decide whether or not they should apply or pay the application fee. We hear that complaint a lot as paying a bunch of application fees when they weren't, really their screening, they wouldn't have been able to apply anyways. Applicants should be provided with information on how to mitigate any circumstances or how to submit mitigating circumstances, how to submit reasonable accommodation requests, and how to contest any inaccurate, incomplete, or irrelevant records. And that's really important because data can be incorrect or outdated. So allowing applicants to really contest that and give you appropriate information is really a great best practice. Next slide. If an applicant is denied, allowing them to really challenge the negative information. Maybe they have other information that kind of help you understand why they were denied. Maybe they have a chance to show you that even if the record is accurate, that they can comply with tenancy obligations. They've attended, a rehabilitation program, a financial literacy program. Maybe there's been a change in their employment status. Really just showing you that the reasons that they were denied previously are no longer an issue. And making sure that process is clear of how to challenge the negative information. Next slide, please. Some other factors to be considering: credit history. Credit scores are a mean to assess creditworthiness or likelihood of paying back borrowed money on time. Credit history does not generally, I know this is kind of changing, but generally credit history does not capture timely rent, utility, other bill payments, payday, or non-traditional lender payments. So Credit scores are really just looking at borrowed money and if the likelihood of paying that back. So it should be just something to consider if it's appropriate for you to be asking that. Housing providers should allow for explanation, requests for reasonable accommodations due to disability when it comes to credit history. Questions to consider. What information are you trying to get by checking their credit history? Is there another way that you can get this information? Say your question is, will the applicant pay their rent? Well, an alternative is income verification or maybe positive, landlord references of, this tenant paid their rent, for 4 years on time. They had no issue. So there's other ways to get the information. So just consider that when you're thinking about your policies around credit history. Next slide. There are no known studies on the relationship between credit reports and successful tenancy. So really having no or limited credit history is even more relevant than having poor credit history. Admitting applicants so long as they do not have a negative credit history can be a more precise policy than requiring a positive credit history. Automated screening tools can be programmed to rely on other available financial information as a substitute for absent credit score. Just so be thinking about other ways, again, to get the information you're looking for about credit history. Next slide. Eviction history is another factor, and it's a common marketing screening component, and it is pulled from private databases that are from court records. But according to the Urban Institute, there is no national requirement for courts to clean, maintain, or share data in a specific way. As a result, there is a tremendous variability and at times inaccuracy in court records. So not only with other screening records, but eviction is another one that may not be cleaned, may not be maintained appropriately, or be inaccurate. So housing providers should not rely on eviction records that are old, incomplete, irrelevant, or where a better measure of an applicant's behavior is available. So again, what information do you need to know to say that this person right now can be a tenant or not? Next slide. Make sure you're distinguishing between the different types of evictions and their outcomes. Again, I have mentioned this already, but when the tenant prevailed or a settlement was released or it was dropped, really should not be considered. Neither should no fault evictions, which would be, if the property was removed from the market. So even if you see immediately that an applicant has a eviction, it doesn't on an automatic no. You should be looking at it to see, okay, what was it? Just because it was an eviction on their record, maybe it was a no-fault eviction. So should be looking into it a little bit more as you're going through your screening process. And then again, applicants should get the chance to afterward to have the record disregarded and corrections made. Next slide, please. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, tenant screening companies must include existing disposition information for eviction records. So just that's something to note. Questions to really consider again for eviction. What do you need to know about the eviction to determine if they would be a good tenant now? Why, when, what were their circumstances? Was it so long ago that they no longer apply? Again, just be considering these things. Next slide. Criminal records, using criminal history to inconsistently screen, deny lease, renewal, evict, or otherwise exclude individuals of different characteristics from housing may be illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Something also to be aware of or consider that reasonable accommodations may be asked regarding criminal records, and they may be required. This could be making exceptions to admission policy or disregarding certain criminal records. A person's disability might make it unlikely that they would reoffend, or that may be related to a mental health disability that has since been treated. And this is something that we have helped folks with in the past. So this is something that is very more common than not, is getting reasonable accommodations to criminal records, especially if they cannot reoffend and it's now, a disability that they can now show has been treated. Next slide, please. Some examples: a landlord states a no felonies policy to a Black applicant but waives it for a white applicant, or a landlord tells a Latina applicant with an arrest record that the apartment is already rented but shows it's available to a white applicant with an arrest record. So again, there is a difference in treatment here based on race. Make sure that all of your policies are applied equally to every single person, and you don't go away from your policies. Next slide, please. So best practices when it comes to your procedures, make sure you're checking state or local laws that may limit your ability to run criminal background checks. Different localities have different local laws. I think the Detroit area has some protections when it comes to criminal background, or they have, different local laws. So just make sure you know about those, because it could impact how you're running your criminal background checks. There may be program requirements, restrictions, or regulations, so make sure you're aware of those. Consider not using criminal history to screen for tenants for housing. And then avoid third-party screening companies that use biased algorithms. Delay considering criminal history even until after verifying financial or other qualifications. So making sure that there are other, that really the person can, the applicant can live there, based on financial and your other qualifications, and then you can run your criminal history report. Treat comparable criminal history similarly. If you're denying an applicant or evicting someone, make sure you provide them with the criminal record or the opportunity to correct the wrong information or explain the extenuating circumstances. And then if you're evicting, only evict for criminal activity as a last resort and after an individualized assessment has been done. So you're really looking at the situation around it. What is the criminal record? Is it a harm to people or property, which will be in the next slide, if you want to go next slide. So when looking at your criminal background policies, you should be considering the nature and the severity. Is it a felony or a misdemeanor? Is it how recent is it? Is it 20 years ago? Are they really a demonstrable risk to president's safety and property? So that's the next one there is, really distinguish between what criminal conduct is a risk to your residents and your community and your property. So examples would be, homicides or sexual assault or arson. And then, the criminal conduct that may not be a risk, gambling, prostitution, tax crimes, cyber crimes, etc. Avoid automatic denials and blanket bans, no felonies, and consideration of arrest. So avoid all of those that really can open you up to fair housing risk. And then again, provide an individualized assessment of relevant mitigating information. Next slide. Again, if you you are with a PHA or have any projects related to federal funding, you must deny admission to anyone who within the last 3 years has been evicted from federal housing for drug-related criminal activity, unless there's drug rehabilitation or the circumstances no longer exist. 2, current users of illegal drugs, abusers of alcohol, or pattern interfering with the health, safety, and peaceful enjoyment of others in the community. Anyone who has been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamine on a federally assisted property, anyone subject to the lifetime sex offender list, or anyone with a history of alcohol abuse that a responsible entity So anyone with a history of alcohol abuse that really threatens the health, safety, and peaceful enjoyment of the property. And so these are a must denies based on if you're a public housing authority or receive federal housing assistance. Next slide. If you are in a low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC property, there is a criminal history outlined in your LIHTC compliance manual, and that's the section in which you can find that. We do have those linked. The handbook does outline criminal background screening criteria, and you can find it on page 4 to 18. But essentially, it's very similar to the previous slide, but you must have screening criteria that prohibits admission to people who have engaged in drug-related criminal behavior, are on the lifetime sex offender registration, or those who abuse or have a pattern of abuse that interferes of alcohol that interferes with the health, safety, or right to peaceful enjoyment of the premises. You may choose to expand on these requirements. However, it is not required. Next slide, please. Okay, let's see if polls are working yet. And then I will look at to see if there are any questions. Let's see, poll 6. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so apologies again on this. I don't know what is happening. So for poll 6, which of these policies and practices have the lowest fair housing risk? A, provide applicants with information on how to dispute inaccurate, incomplete, and/or relevant records. B, develop and document clear policies that are transparent to applicants. C, regularly review screening and application criteria. D, allow leasing agents to decide when to request or receive certain information, criminal history, credit history, or housing history. E, in your criminal background policy, consider the nature, severity, and recency of your criminal conduct. And this is multiple choice. So please choose the policies and practices that have the lowest fair housing risk. A, B, C, D, and E. So again, apologies for the polls not working. This has only happened one other time. So I'm not really sure how to problem solve it. Give folks a few minutes to answer. Okay, so it looks like, oops, another wave of people are answering, no worries. Folks are starting to slow down, so I'm gonna move on also for the sake of time. So for the policies that have the lowest fair housing risk, A, B, C, and E all have the lowest fair housing risk. So, has the highest risk is if you're allowing your leasing agents to decide when to require or request certain information. That is a really bad policy. Okay, next slide. Again, we have another poll here. Before we go to the break, we have 2 more. So this one, which of the following groups must comply with fair housing? Property owners, condo association board members, contracted staff, managers, maintenance team, residents, none of the above, or all of the above. It should be multiple choice, but again, we don't have the polls, so apologies on that. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then H would be all of the above. So which groups must comply? And it is supposed to be multiple choice. Okay, I am gonna move on for the sake of time, but it is everyone. Everyone must comply that is connected to the housing. So yeah, even your contracted staff, your condo, especially your condo association board members, maintenance team, not just, the leasing staff, it's everyone that's associated with the housing. Great job. I saw a lot of all in there, so good job, everyone. And then last poll before we move on. Lindsay had talked about this way in the beginning, so hopefully you were paying attention. Based on national and fair housing, our data, what protected characteristic has the highest allegation? A, race, B, families with children, C, disability, D, religion, E, sex. Based on our data and national data, what protected characteristic has the highest allegation? Race, families with children, disability, religion, and sex. Oh, this is a very divided group. Okay. I'm going to move on with the answer now. The answer is C, disability. Disability, based on national and our data, has had the highest allegations of discrimination. And for us and for the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, our data has been that way for about over a decade now, that disability is the #1 allegation of discrimination. So, and with that, if you want to go to the next slide. We are now on a break. We will do a 10-minute break and then come back. So come back at 45. That worked out perfectly. 10:45, take a break, stretch, get some coffee, and then we will return and dive into a breakdown of the protected characteristics. So be back at 9:45 all. Thank you. I'm at 10:45. I realized I said 9. 10:45, please be back. This is a 1-minute warning to folks. If people want to start heading back to their desks or getting back into the groove of listening, got 1 minute. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, everyone is settling in to their desks or seat. If you're sharing your desk today with folks, we will now dive into the protected characteristics. We're going to go one by one. So feel free to put any questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them throughout the presentation or at the end, depending on time. Okay, so for the first one, race, color, and national origin. Race refers to, next slide. Race refers to people distinguished by socially significant or perceived physical characteristics. This can include hair texture, skin color, eye shape, or other differences. Color is also protected. This refers to a person's skin color. So if they're light or dark, there's difference of treatment we've seen on the basis of color before. National origin refers to one's country of origin or an individual's birth or where their ancestors originated from. This can include birthplace, ethnicity, ancestry, cultural accent, spoken language, appearance associated with a specific nationality, and more. Additionally, something just to be aware of, the perception of someone's race, color, or national origin is also protected under law. So if somebody is discriminated against and it actually isn't their race, color, or national origin that they were discriminated against, it's still that perception of them being a certain race, color, or national origin, and that you denied them or someone denied them, that is protected. So again, even if it isn't the right information of why the denial happened, but it was based on a characteristic, it's still illegal. There is quickly a case example, and if you've attended our trainings before, I apologize, you've probably heard this one, but this one is there was an older gentleman who was looking for senior housing. He was from California. He was a Black gentleman. He was a previous engineer, and I believed he was in the military, and he was applying to senior housing to be closer to his doctor's office. He was undergoing medical treatment, and he was really friendly with the leasing agent. She knew all about his family and everything, but could have nice conversation with him. He would call, weekly to see where he was on a waiting list, because he was on a waiting list. And every week, he wasn't, it still didn't really change. One day he came home from an appointment and saw his neighbor who was moving. It was a white woman. And he was like, "Oh, where are you moving?" And she was at ABC Senior Community. He was like, "No way, I've been waiting for so long on their waiting list. Like, how long did you wait?" And she was like, 2 months. And he had been waiting for 7 years on a waiting list. It was found that they were maintaining 2 wait lists based on race. So that is, again, difference of treatment there. Unfortunately, that gentleman did pass away. From what I last heard, is that the family was pursuing, his estate was pursuing the case forward. But that, again, that is race-based discrimination, having 2 different waiting lists based on race. So that's a really unfortunate circumstance, and it could be potentially tied and to, we could say that he, his access to medical care could have been interrupted due to that because he was moving there, so he would be closer to his medical facility. So yeah, it's a really unfortunate thing that happens when discrimination happens. Really sad. Next slide, please. Some other examples of possible discrimination: a landlord renting to light-skinned African Americans, but not those who are darker skinned. Lindsay talked about steering earlier, but steering darker skinned applicants to units in the back of the complex. Treating a resident differently because of the race of their guests. A landlord, we've talked about this one, but a landlord stating a no felonies policy to a Black applicant, but then waiving it for a white applicant. Next slide. Now I'm going to be talking about sex and gender. Next slide. There is no preference on the basis of sex should be stated. Gender preference language can only be used in advertising for roommates or if there are shared living areas. So if there is a shared kitchen or bathroom or common spaces, that is the only time gender preference language can be used in advertising. Next slide. Some examples: refusing to rent to female tenants because the lease includes taking care of the yard and snow removal. Some instances, treating someone differently because they are a survivor of domestic violence. Sexual harassment is also considered discrimination under the sex and gender protection. And then a housing provider evicting a female victim of domestic violence, but not the male perpetrator, would be another example of sex and gender discrimination. Next slide. Now moving into disability status, and I know this is where we often get a lot of questions, so please put them in the chat, and either someone will try to type a response to you or I can get to them at the end. So next slide. Disability status is broadly defined under the Fair Housing Act, and it covers both mental disabilities as well as physical disabilities. It's defined as having a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity, a record of having such an impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. So kind of similar to the perception of, so if you're being treated as if you have a certain disability, that is also protected under disability status. Next slide. So what is a major life activity? This is also pretty broadly construed. It includes physical, mental, and social activities, as well as working. So sleeping, walking, bathing, eating, breathing, driving, hearing, seeing are just some examples. And then there is we'll go into some examples per different types of discrimination. So go next slide. Disability status, it is permissible to specify under disability status a no smoking or other similar behavior, but you cannot discriminate against people with health conditions or physical problems. Addiction is considered a disability only if it is not current drinking or drug use. So if somebody is in recovery, then alcoholism and drug addiction is considered a disability under the Fair Housing Act. So make sure you're clearly stating the unacceptable behavior. It's no drinking rather than the type of person, no drinkers. Again, if you're going to say what type of behavior is not allowed, make sure it's not connected to a person. Again, any type of person-centered language, especially connected to a protected characteristic, really opens you up to fair housing risk. Next slide. An example of discrimination based on disability status: a leasing agent refusing to show units to someone using a wheelchair, saying it wouldn't be a good fit. That is up to the person with the disability. If they decide they don't want that unit as a leasing agent, it is your job to just show them all of the units that are within, if they're looking for a 2-bedroom, if they are looking for, financially what they can afford, just those criteria. And then you show them all the units available, and then they can decide which ones don't work for them. But just offering them is important because reasonable modifications, which we will talk about, is something that a person with a disability can request. Refusal to assign a designated accessible parking space as a reasonable accommodation to a first come, first served parking policy. And then a refusal to permit reasonable modifications, which we will talk about, and then asking applicants for medical history to prove that they have a disability or to prove that they can live independently. The latter half of that we do see a lot with senior housing. If it is just independent living, it is just housing. If there are no services tied with senior housing, specifically senior housing, if there's no services tied to that, you cannot ask if they prove that they can live independently. Yes, it is independent living, but it is really just housing. There's no services attached, so you cannot ask more about their disabilities or if they can live independently. So that's something important to make sure you're not doing if you are in senior housing. Next slide, please. So a reasonable accommodation is a change in any rule, policy, procedure, or service if the changes are needed in order for a person with a disability to have equal access and enjoyment of their housing. Some examples would be waiving a no pet policy for a person with a disabilities trained assistance animal, a transfer to a different floor or unit, exempting rent based on the arrival date of the disability income. Those are examples of reasonable accommodations. Generally, reasonable accommodations are the responsibility of the housing provider because they are your rules, your policies. So waiving them because a person has a disability and disability-related need is something that can be requested. The link there is just to a joint statement on reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act. It's a really, really great document to really just know different examples and questions that you may have on reasonable accommodations. So please utilize that as a resource when processing accommodations. Next slide. For processing reasonable accommodations, be thinking about what does your existing rule or policy say, the applicable rule or policy say. How does this request differ from that policy or rule or that standard procedure or service? If you do need documentation, well, it depends if they have a visible disability. When or how does the policy, service, and get changed? All of it does require homework, and that is something that we can help walk you through. So you're welcome to call our office if you have specific questions on reasonable accommodations. Next slide. Under the 1973 Rehabilitation Act in Section 504, there are, so again, going back to that question, do you receive federal funding? It is important to know this because if you do receive federal financial assistance, if you're a HUD subsidized apartment building, USDA, rural housing development, or other, it is considered a reasonable accommodation. So if a person needs structural changes, which generally would be a reasonable modification, even though we haven't gone into that, but under the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, if you receive federal financial assistance and a person needs to make a structural change, it is considered a reasonable accommodation and it must be paid by the housing provider, unless it would be undue financial and administrative burden or a fundamental alteration of the program, or unless the housing provider can accommodate through other means. So again, with any of our reasonable accommodation or modification processes, make sure you're working with the person with the disability to make sure what you're proposing, what they're asking for is doable and works for them. The people with disabilities know what best works for them, so having them lead that conversation is really important. But if you receive federal financial assistance, you must pay for a structural change. Next slide. So a reasonable modification is a structural or physical change to the unit or housing to provide a person with a disability physical access. Some examples, installing a ramp to a building's entrance, and permission to install grab bars, permission to install hand levers versus a door knob, adjusting the height of outlets or thermostats, and altering a walkway. If they must be allowed when they're reasonable, for the most part, housing providers may require that the tenant obtain all necessary building permits and that it be performed in a workmanlike manner. So you can still request, that it's done well and that they're doing it, legally. Again, there's another joint statement on reasonable modifications that is a really great tool to use when processing them. Next slide. When processing reasonable modifications, be thinking about who will use it. Is it something that would benefit more folks in the unit or in the building? It would just be thinking about that. Will there be any issues regarding code compliance? Do you need documentation? Do you need plans and drawings? Thinking about, again, who pays depends on how the property is funded, and then that determines which laws apply. If it's private housing, generally the tenant pays, and it's federally funded housing, generally the housing provider pays. But again, knowing all that information is helpful in processing those modifications. Thinking about what happens when the tenant moves out. Is it something that you're going to keep and you're in private housing, and then maybe it's something that you pay for? So just those questions can help inform how you're going to move forward with the modification. Again, requires homework, and that's something we can help with. I'm not sure if this link to this guidebook will work, but we are in the process of updating those, and we will send out a notice when those are available. Our new guidebooks, we've just updated them, so a little bit easier to navigate and read. Next slide. For accommodations and modifications, tenants can request them at any time. Tenants with unobservable disabilities or disability-based needs can be asked documentation on why they need the change. Tenants can request more than one accommodation or modification, and requests must not create an unreasonable burden on the housing provider, such as not getting paid rent. Again, this is something, if you're going through any accommodation or modification request, it is something that we can assist you with based on, you have to be located in our service area. Otherwise, we can refer you out to a local fair housing center. But again, we have guidebooks that also can help, which will be available hopefully in the coming weeks. Next slide. This is an example, a good example of, striped parking or striped lines, clear signage. There is, the easement of going from the parking lot to the sidewalk is there. This is just a really good example of, considering disability-related parking. And if you go to the next slide, this is a bad example of providing accessible entrances. This was actually used in court. The judge was not happy about it. They literally just stuck a sign on stairs. It feels, to me, every time I see this, it feels like a really, really bad joke. And it's not funny, but it just, I don't know why they thought that would just putting the sign up would make it accessible. That's a bad example. Don't do that. Next slide. For assistance animals, under the Fair Housing Act in Section 504, individuals with disabilities may be entitled to keep an assistance animal as a reasonable accommodation. If in order to qualify for an accommodation, the assistance animal must be necessary to afford the individual an equal opportunity to use, enjoy the dwelling, or participate in the housing service or program. There also must be a relationship or nexus between the disability and the assistance the animal provides. If these requirements are met, a housing facility, program, or service must permit the assistance animal as an accommodation, unless it can demonstrate that allowing it would impose an undue financial or administrative burden or fundamentally alter the nature of the housing. Next slide. The request may also be denied if the animal in question poses a direct threat to the health and safety and cannot be reduced or eliminated by a reasonable accommodation, or if the specific animal would cause substantial physical damage to the property of others that cannot be reduced or eliminated by a reasonable accommodation. So, some common examples we see is for posing a direct threat, maybe the dog or the assistance animal, barks at people, is something that could happen is to reduce or eliminate it would be putting on a muzzle. So there are other ways to mitigate it to still allow that person to have their assistance animal if they're a person with a disability and disability-related need. Next slide. Best practices when it comes to assistance animals. We really do recommend adopting an assistance animal policy that is located on our website. And it has clear guidelines to ensure that everyone understands their rights and responsibilities when it comes to assistance animals. You as a housing provider understand, this is your right as a person with a disability to have an assistance animal, but also as my tenant and making sure, the animal is in control and that it's being taken care of, cleaning up after, basic things that some folks may not understand is their responsibility. But if you have a policy, that assistance animal policy that says so, then that's clear to them what their responsibilities as a tenant is. Housing providers may also want to maintain an easily accessible list of all the accommodations granted so that all staff, including maintenance, are aware of the assistance animals living in the housing. This could also be crucial, especially if you are a no-pet property, just knowing, okay, which units do have assistance animals living in them. The owners of assistance animals must ensure that their assistant animal is under control and cleaned up after, or they must make arrangements to do so. Next slide. As a housing provider, you should not be requiring the use of specific forms. You can have a form be available, but you cannot require that it be used. If the person brings in documentation to show they have a disability and disability-related need, you cannot require another form. You cannot require details about the diagnosis or the severity of a disability or medical records or a medical examination. It's really just getting way too much information that you don't need. As a housing provider, you need to know that the person has a disability and they have a disability-related need for their assistance animal. You cannot rely on a no pets policy to deny a request for a trained assistance animal. It should not apply to pet policies should not apply to trained assistance animals. You cannot place restrictions on the breed, size, or weight of trained assistance animals. And if you get a request, you should make a determination pretty promptly, generally within 10 days of receiving documentation. If the original request is denied, you must discuss or offer alternative accommodations. And this is the case for all reasonable accommodations and modifications. If the original request is denied for any accommodation or modification, alternatives should be offered or discussed. Next slide. A housing provider is entitled to, when it comes to documentation, housing providers are able to get information that is necessary to say whether or not a reasonable modification is necessary because of a disability. But this is only when the disability is not obvious or known. So maybe they already have accommodations or modifications for some other things. So then you would already know about this disability, or they receive SSDI, or they've just talked to you about it. Or again, if it's not obvious. And then also if the disability-related need is not readily apparent or otherwise known to you. So you get a reasonable accommodation or modification request, stop and think, okay, what do I already know? Your immediate response shouldn't be, okay, I need a letter. Because if it's a person in a wheelchair that is requesting a ramp, it's pretty obvious why they need the ramp. Their disability is obvious and the need is obvious. But not every disability is visible, so you can request documentation if the disability is not known or obvious, or the need is not known or obvious. Next slide. Excuse me. If the disability is not obvious, what kind of information may a housing provider request? Well, what do you still need to know? Generally, you need to confirm that the person has a disability as defined by law, and there's a disability-related need. That's really all you should need to know as a housing provider, and don't need the details of the disability, the treatment plan of the disability. You do not want that information. You just want to know, do they have a disability as defined by law, and is there a disability-related need for what they're requesting? Next slide. When processing requests, it really depends on the circumstances presented, if you approve or deny them, and if, what other things you may need. It's really should be done on a case-by-case basis. Process all of them on a case-by-case basis. What information do you have? What information do you need? Make sure you're documenting every step taken, any information given to the tenant, or any information given to you from the tenant. It's also important that you keep all information confidential. No, people with disabilities typically have the most accurate knowledge of their functional limitation posed by their disability. So I did mention this earlier. They are the best, knowledgeable person about their limitations by their disability. So really be listening, taking notes, understanding what they need if, what they've asked for cannot be done. When it comes to reasonableness, how do you decide what is reasonable? Some things to be considering. Is there an undue financial and administrative burden on the housing provider? Would the accommodation fundamentally alter the nature of the housing provider's operations? An example we have used in the past is, one, not paying rent. That would not be, well, that would not be an undue financial or administrative burden, but altering the nature of your operations. A person cannot drive due to a disability, so they request you to take them to their appointments or pick up their medication. Well, that would require you to hire a driver, buy a mode of transportation to take from. It's just not within your nature of your operation, so that would not be reasonable as a reasonable accommodation request. Again, if the original request is unreasonable, what are alternatives? You must provide them, and they must effectively meet the person's needs, and they must be offered. Anytime it's you're denying something, you should offer an alternative. Next slide. Okay, polls are still not working, so apologies about that. So we will do this in the chat. But what should you do in this instant? A person with a heart condition requests a reserved parking spot due to not being able to walk long distances. A, request documentation from a healthcare provider. B, tell them they can use the existing handicap spot outside the unit. C, have them pay for the materials to put up a sign for a reserved spot. And D, meet with them to discuss the request. And this is multiple choice. Okay, I'll give another minute here, or another few seconds here. Get in your answers. What should you do if a person with a heart condition requests a parking spot? Okay. I'm seeing some slowdowns, maybe. Every time I think not. Okay. A person with a heart condition requests a reserved parking spot due to not being able to walk long distances. What should you do as the housing provider? It would be A, request documentation from a healthcare provider. Only if you don't know of their disability and it's not apparent. But in this world, we're going to say that you don't know. So request documentation from a healthcare provider. And then D, meet with them to discuss the request. B and C are not appropriate because the person is requesting a reserved parking spot. The existing handicap spots outside of units are under ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act, and under the Fair Housing Act, a person can request a reserved parking spot. The existing ones outside are for public use. Anyone can use them that has, that handicap placard. We've seen and heard, there's been case examples in the past where folks aren't leaving their units because they don't want to lose that handicap spot because they know it's really sought after. People can request reserved parking spots due to disabilities. The existing handicap spots outside are not enough. And then again, having them pay for the materials to put up a sign for a reserved spot. They are asking for an accommodation, so it is on you as the housing provider to pay for that. Next slide. Okay, perfect. For this next one, what documentation is needed? A senior housing applicant using a motorized scooter requests permission to use different hinges on her front door to increase the space to enter her apartment. What do you need? You need to A, information on her disability, B, information on her disability-related need, C, information on her disability and disability-related need, D, she doesn't need to provide information, or E, I am not sure. Okay, also for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. For this, a senior applicant using a motorized scooter need different hinges. The more appropriate thing, you already know about their disability. You can see they're using a scooter, but you may not understand the disability related need. So you can request information on the disability related need. So B. However, if you are familiar with the hinges and changing it, then D may be appropriate, but in this instance, we'll say the need only. Okay. And then I see there are some questions in the chat, but for sake of time, I'm going to then now pass it over to Lindsay, and we'll get to questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Bree. Just a reminder to make sure to put your questions in the Q&A, especially because we're using the chat for the polls. We probably won't be able to find questions placed in the chat, so make sure to use the Q&A. Okay, I'm going to discuss a bit about familial and marital status. It's unlawful under our federal and state fair housing laws to discriminate against anyone because of their familial status. Familial status refers to whether or not an individual has minor children under the age of 18 living with them. A family can include single individual, pregnant people, people in the process of adopting or securing legal custody, and foster children. I think we will move on for the sake of time, so we can make sure we can answer some of your questions at the end. Some examples of possible discrimination based on familial status can include having a policy that residents cannot have more than 2 children in the household, refusing to rent or sell to a family because of the presence of children under the age of 18 or pregnancy, denying families or children access to recreational facilities, imposing unreasonable rules because children are present, or rules specifically targeted at children, charging an extra fee per child, or higher rent or security deposits because of the presence of a child, imposing different standards based on children's ages, restricting families to certain floors or areas of a complex, and housing advertisements that say adults only or no kids. So these are examples of possible housing discrimination against families with children. Marital status is protected at the state level. It protects people whether or not they are married. As such, protections include people who are single, divorced, widows, widowers, married or separated couples. A person's marital status can never be used for the basis of discrimination. Some possible examples of discrimination based on marital status include things like charging more rent for couples who are not married, requiring a higher rent or down payment for a single woman, not letting people add a partner to their lease because they are not married, requiring a couple to be married before moving in together, and suggesting people move based on a change in their marital status. Something to think about when it comes to familial and marital status protections is occupancy limits or standards. Housing providers must comply with all applicable local laws, regulations, and financing requirements when it comes to occupancy limits, including property maintenance codes, zoning codes, minimum floor area requirements, and others. These occupancy restrictions often consider the number and size of habitable rooms and the overall size and configuration of units. Housing providers' policies on occupancy should really comply with all applicable local laws, regulations, and financing requirements. However, their policies should not be more restrictive than applicable laws and requirements. Providers should also be aware of applicable occupancy standards for all their properties. They can change based on areas where your properties are located. You can find more information on occupancy standards linked below, and you can feel free to reach out to us. A really helpful thing is to know the square footage and configuration of your properties when you're trying to determine what occupancy standards might apply to your properties. Although a housing provider may reasonably limit occupancy based on set standards, it's best to keep these limits out of advertising. When you state how many people can live in a unit, it could invite a discrimination claim. It's really best to go back to our section on advertising to just describe the amenities, what the property is like, rather than and the property size, rather than stating a set limit on how many people can live there in your advertisements. So saying a 2-bedroom apartment, 3-bedroom apartment, single family home, stuff like that would be better than stating how many people can live there. Offering different rates based on the number of people to occupy housing may also violate fair housing laws. So examples of violations could be charging $1,000 per month for 2 people, $50 more for each additional person, and indicating people without kids get a preferential price, or that there are penalties for getting married. So some of the connections to occupancy standards with familial and marital status. Okay, now we'll discuss a bit more about religion protections under the federal and state protections. The discrimination based on religion is prohibited under local, state, and federal fair housing laws. It protects against religious discrimination, whether one is a member of a particular religion or no religion at all. The Fair Housing Act provides a narrow exemption for religious organizations to limit the sale, rental, or occupancy of housing to members of their own religion, as long as the housing's not operated for a commercial purpose. So an example of this exemption might be a monastery or convent housing. Advertising for this housing should include a disclaimer statement such as this home does not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. As long as symbols or terms relating to religious holidays are secularized, they'll not automatically constitute violations of fair housing laws. Some examples could include terms like Merry Christmas or Santa Claus. Statements using the legal name of an establishment that contain a religious reference or a religious symbol may violate the law unless it includes a disclaimer stating that they do not discriminate on the basis of protected characteristics. Housing providers are allowed to describe services or facilities that are available at a particular housing unit, such as an apartment complex with a chapel or a senior housing development with kosher meals available. Here are some examples of discrimination based on religion, including prohibiting the use of community spaces within a complex for religious purposes if those areas are permitted for to be used for secular gatherings, asking applicants about their religion, ignoring or not following up with an applicant because of their religion, advertising that a home is located near a particular place of worship, allowing religious decorations for certain religions but not for others, making negative comments about a person's religion, or harassing tenants who wear religious accessories such as head coverings or garments, creating or tolerating graffiti or vandalism representing religion-based hatred, and running housing ads in only one religious publication. So those are some potential examples of housing discrimination based on religion. Okay, moving on to age protections. Age is protected under our state and local fair housing laws. Age refers to biological age. As long as a person can legally enter into a contract, meaning they're over 18 years old or they're emancipated, age can't be used as a basis to discriminate against someone in the state of Michigan. There is an exemption that we talked about a bit earlier, that senior housing is exempt from age and familial status protections. Just some notes on what emancipation might mean. In the state of Michigan, a minor, a person under the age of 18, is emancipated automatically in the following circumstances. So when the minor is legally married, when they reach the age of 18 years old, while on active duty in the armed forces of the United States, or emancipated under the laws of another state. There's also another kind of point under the emancipation, this emancipation like rules or like, I don't know what the word is for it, but a minor could also be emancipated if, in the case of consenting to medical care, if the child's parents cannot be located, and if the child is in the custody of law enforcement. So that might apply less to the housing realm. So these are some examples of potential age discrimination in housing. So condo associations limiting occupants or buyers based on age, apartment complexes steering certain age groups to certain areas or buildings, such as an under 14 building, refusing to rent to someone because they're over or under a certain age, such as no one under 40 years old, advertising statements like dynamic community for young adults that indicate a preference for younger people, steering older applicants to less desirable units or buildings in an apartment development, more restrictive income credit or rental history requirements to younger or older applicants, and then more advertising statements like adults only or active senior community. So those are some examples of possible discrimination based on age. We discussed earlier that there are exemptions for senior housing. So housing that qualifies as senior housing is exempt from familial status and age protection discrimination under the Housing for Older Persons Act, or HOPA, if it meets the following. So the dwelling is specifically designed for and occupied by elderly persons under federal, state, or local government programs, or occupied solely 100% by people 62 and older, or houses at least one person who is 55 or older in at least 80% of the occupied units, and adheres to a policy that demonstrates an intent to house people who are 55 or older. You can find more information in our guide for seniors, caretakers, and housing providers about HOPA and this the qualifications to be senior housing. And then student status, I believe in Ann Arbor, student status may be protected, and in Holland, education is protected. So make sure to check your local fair housing laws to see if there's any protections for student status. If student status is not protected, it may not violate fair housing laws to give preferences or impose a limit as to students, as long as it's applied to all students, not just students of a traditional college student age. Okay, moving on to sexual orientation and gender identity. Sexual orientation and gender identity are protected under the state of Michigan's Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act and in many local communities. ELCRA provides protections for actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So we talked about the perception of a specific protected characteristic earlier when we talked about race, color, and national origin. So if a housing provider believes that someone has a particular sexual orientation or gender identity, but that assumption is false, but they still treat someone differently, that is also protected, even if the housing provider's perception is false. Sexual orientation is a person's enduring physical, romantic, or emotional attraction to another person. So examples of sexual orientations are heterosexual or straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, pansexual, and others. Under ELCRA, sexual orientation is defined as having an orientation for heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality, or having a history of such an orientation, or being identified with such an orientation. Gender identity is a person's internal, deeply held knowledge of their own gender. It's different than sexual orientation and includes man, woman, non-binary, and others. Under ELCRA, gender identity and expression are defined as having or being perceived as having a gender-related self-identity or expression, whether associated with an individual's assigned sex at birth or not. Gender expression, just to note, is the external manifestations of gender expressed through a person's name, pronouns, clothing, haircut, voice, or behavior. So again, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are all protected under Michigan state Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act laws, and also protected in many municipalities in our area. These are two examples of potential discrimination, I think particularly based on sexual orientation. The leasing manager at a 55 plus community rejects a male tenant's request to add a same-sex partner to his lease, stating that the community only accepts married couples and unions between one man and one woman. And then a maintenance worker employed by a housing provider subjecting a female tenant to pervasive harassment because she's a lesbian. Additional discrimination occurs when the tenant reports the harassment to the housing provider who fails to take action to stop the harassment. So those are two examples of possible discrimination based on sexual orientation. Now I will go into source of income protections. Just to know, if you have questions throughout this section, please put them in the Q&A so that we can answer them at the end. So like we talked about earlier, really briefly, source of income refers to where one's income comes from. Housing providers can always consider a tenant's income, their ability to pay rent, and other financial obligations. Source of income protections prohibit housing providers from specifying or limiting the source of income they accept. So again, housing providers can always consider a tenant's income, they just can't specify or limit where that income comes from or that they accept that income. These protections were really put in place to help cost-burdened or severely cost-burdened families to obtain and maintain housing. The following include source of income protections, properties financed with low-income housing tax credit, Michigan Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, Michigan's Landlord-Tenant Act, and local protections in different municipalities, including Grand Rapids, Holland, Kentwood, and Wyoming. Just a bit about the history of Michigan's source of income protections under the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act and Landlord-Tenant Act. In 2025, Governor Whitmer signed 5 bills that together amended both ELCRA and the Landlord-Tenant Act, and this went into effect in April of last year. Michigan's source of income protections define it as including benefit or subsidy programs, including housing or public assistance, housing choice vouchers, veterans benefits, Social Security, supplemental security income, other retirement programs, and other programs administered by any federal, state, local, or nonprofit entity. Source of income may also include other types of housing vouchers, child support, alimony, and other sources. And then for LIHTC, all properties financed with the low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC are required to accept vouchers as a source of income. LIHTC properties are expressly prohibited from discriminating against voucher holders. Owners who have their properties funded or financed through LIHTC are required to certify every year that they're adhering to these requirements. And then state housing agencies are responsible for monitoring LIHTC properties owners for their compliance with this requirement to accept vouchers as a source of income. Just want to touch a bit on what housing choice vouchers are and VASH vouchers are. Housing choice vouchers, or HCVs, are rental assistance funded by the federal government and administered by local public housing authorities to help households with low incomes pay their rent. A tenant with a housing choice voucher pays a fixed portion of the rent, and then the program pays the remainder of the rent directly to the landlord. The VASH program is a type of HCV or housing choice voucher that aids veterans who are experiencing homelessness and their families. The program also includes case management and clinical services provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Just a note about what housing choice vouchers and VASH vouchers are. Under Michigan source of income protections, housing providers are allowed to require a certain income amount to rent a unit, but they cannot specify the source of said income. A person's source of income does need to be legal and ongoing, so source of income protections are not going to include income derived in an illegal manner. And then the Michigan source of income protection laws put into place under ELCRA and the Landlord Tenant Act in 2025 do task housing agencies with handling vouchers to approve applications within 30 days. Just to note, source of income does not include housing assistance that is not approved by the appropriate agency within 30 days after the landlord provides all information required as a condition of the agency's approval, including evidence that all repairs required before occupancy have been completed. So that part of the protections is really to try and get those agencies tasked with handling vouchers to push to get them out quicker and in a timely manner. Michigan's source of income protections provide exemptions for small landlords with fewer than 5 units in the state of Michigan. If a housing provider has several LLCs, operating entities, or a mix of units that are privately owned, some under a corporation, etc. These are all related entities and they are not exempt if there are more than 5. We covered that part. When we think of who is covered by source of income protections, it's a landlord with 5 or more housing units in Michigan. Under the law, landlords of rental units or rental property include the owner, the person who leases or subleases to someone, and any person authorized to exercise any aspect of the management of the unit, including a person who acts as a rental agent or receives rent. It includes partnerships, corporations, associations, limited liability companies, or other legal entities that offer residential rental units for rent. This includes property managers, rental agents, real estate agents, and brokers. Just want to note with the exemption that there is a potential, this might apply to a rental professional audience, but there's a potential that sometimes people there may be an owner who has a property management company manage their units, and that owner might only own one property, so they would potentially be exempt under these Michigan source of income protections. But if the property management company manages more than 5 units in the state of Michigan, they're not going to be exempt under these protections, even if the owner themselves would be exempt. And so property management companies couldn't say an owner who is exempt wouldn't want to rent to people who have housing choice vouchers, for example. The property management company can't fulfill those wishes if they have more than 5 or more units in the state of Michigan that they're managing. So just a note about that, please feel free to ask us questions. Okay, when we think of what's prohibited under source of income protections, it includes things like denials or terminations, changes in prices, terms, conditions, fees, privileges, facilities, or services connected to the unit because of source of income. So some examples could be refusing to rent to someone because they have a Social Security income, SSI or SSDI. That would be an example of something that's prohibited. Some other examples could be charging extra fees, higher deposits, or higher rent because someone has an HCV, not maintaining units occupied by voucher holders to the same standard as other units, and not providing equal access to facilities and amenities based on a tenant's source of income. So those are examples of prohibited activities under Michigan's source of income protections. Other prohibited actions under these source of income protections include making units unavailable if the tenant's otherwise eligible, or representing units as unavailable or knowingly not including them. So some examples of this could be telling an applicant with a VASH voucher that the unit's rented even though it's still available, or not allowing an available unit to be seen or inspected because someone receives alimony. Those are, again, examples of things that are prohibited under Michigan source of income protections. Other prohibited actions include discouraging the rental of units based on source of income, or publishing ads making statements about a preference or limit based on source of income. So this includes requiring additional references for people because of their source of income. That's treating people differently than other applicants because of their source of income. Imposing additional or unreasonable screening criteria because of someone's source of income. Ignoring voucher payments when determining if an applicant has enough income to afford the unit. Those are some examples, as well as placing an advertisement for a rental unit that says working people only or no Section 8, and requiring residents to have a job or work a certain number of hours. Those are all examples of prohibited activities under these Michigan source of income protections in ELCRA and the Landlord-Tenant Act in Michigan. So we talked about those exemptions earlier under the Michigan source of income protections under ELCRA and the Landlord-Tenant Act. But even if a housing provider is exempt under state source of income laws, they may not be exempt under local laws. So there's several municipalities across our service area, including the city of Grand Rapids, Holland, Kentwood, and Wyoming, where source of income is protected. It's typically referred to as a person's legal and verifiable source of income. There may be other local ordinances where your properties are located that may include source of income protections. And then in general, language referring to a person's occupation, lack of occupation, or receipt of some type of government assistance could trigger liability. Generally under the local source of income protections, source of income includes alimony, child support, Social Security payments, and Section 8 vouchers or housing choice vouchers, HCVs. Okay, some best practices when it comes to Michigan source of income laws and just all of our source of income protections that may apply are to provide equal treatment to all applicants and tenants regardless of their source of income, accept and count all income derived from lawful ongoing sources, not expressing any limitations or preferences about income sources or employment status in ads or any communication, working with agencies that administer housing choice voucher or assistance in a timely manner, updating policies and practices as needed to enter into third-party agreements or accept third-party payments, and not retaliating against an applicant or a tenant who's seeking to utilize or enforce their fair housing rights. So those are some best practices when it comes to source of income. Okay, I have a poll. I don't think the polls are going to work, unfortunately. So feel free to state the answers to yourself silently or put it into the chat. But our 11th poll is, which of these scenarios would be a fair housing violation under source of income protections? Please choose all that apply. So someone with a voucher applies to a property because they are denied due to a recent outstanding rent and unpaid damages. B, a voucher holder is charged higher rent because their voucher covers more. C, someone with a voucher puts in a maintenance request and doesn't hear anything for a month. Their neighbor who doesn't have a voucher had a similar issue and it was addressed within a week. We'll give a few minutes to answer that. Make sure to choose all that apply. More than one answer may be correct in this poll. Okay, I see a lot of answers coming in. Thank you all so much for participating in these polls and sticking with us, even though they're not working in Zoom. Okay, I'll give a few more seconds to answer. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people putting C, B and C, a few all of the above. I would agree with the answers B and C. A voucher holder being charged higher rent because their voucher covers more would be a change in price, terms, and conditions based on source of income, which is prohibited under Michigan source of income laws. And then C, a voucher holder receiving different maintenance to their unit than a non-voucher holder would also be prohibited under Michigan source of income laws. So my thoughts are that B and C would be the correct answers for this poll, that those two would be considered violations of source of income protections. Okay. I will turn it over to Bree to discuss best practices and then close out the presentation, and then we will be able to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. And I'm going to be trying speedy through this just for the sake of time and questions. But some best practices, an important rule of thumb, have policies in place and apply them to everyone. Next slide. So know your responsibilities under fair housing law, which ones operate based on where you are, the Federal Fair Housing Act, Michigan Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, what are additional local ordinances with additional protected classes that apply. You can utilize those links that we gave you in the beginning that, really you can find that information. Next slide. Establish application criteria, policies, and procedures that follow in accordance with laws. Do any of your rules or policies or procedures discriminate against anyone because of the protected characteristic? Are there policies or procedures that are applied differently to people who fall in different various protected characteristics? So again, just making sure that they can be applied appropriately to everyone. Next slide. Make sure you're training management, maintenance, and other staff that are associated with the housing on your policies and your commitment to fair housing. Being here today, providing fair housing training is a good risk management strategy. Is everyone who's interacting with potential applicants or current residents aware of fair housing responsibilities and your policies? Sometimes it gets lost in the weeds, especially for, the people that are working on the ground or people that are in the leasing office. Just miscommunication happens. So just making sure that everyone knows what your policies are and what their responsibilities are as connected to the housing. Next slide. Apply everything evenly and consistently across the board. Consistency is key. Are you consistent with the information about vacancies, waiting list, qualifications, rental rates, security deposits, other fees, and all the other information you may request? Are you giving that to everyone across the board? Anytime you leave out any information, it could open you up to fair housing risk, because why didn't you provide that person with that information? So just making sure everyone is consistently giving the information. Next slide. Make sure all tenants and applicants are aware of the criteria. Again, consistency is key. Make sure you're documenting your adherence to these procedures as well. Next slide. Ensure housing for choice. Make sure you are not making choices as a housing provider about which property or unit may meet someone's needs. We often see this with people with disabilities and families with children. Make sure all potential residents are receiving information about all available property units and that they can choose for themselves if it meets their needs. Sometimes we understand, it's coming from the goodness of your heart. You want to make sure that they get the perfect unit, but that is for them to decide. So do not leave out any information because it could be, again, open you up to risk of why you didn't show them that unit. And you'd have to document if they didn't ask for it, or if they did ask for it, that's different. So just make sure you're showing everything and letting the person choose for themselves. Consider reasonable accommodation and modification requests based upon a disability on a case-by-case basis. These changes may be necessary to afford a person with a physical or mental disability, equal use. Use those joint statements that we provided. And then we also have resources available on our website that you can also utilize. Next slide. Familiarize yourself with local occupancy standards that apply to each property. Lindsay briefly talked about that. So just make sure you only need to know the people that occupy the unit. They should not be more restrictive than local standards. Is your occupancy policy following local health and safety standards? And then you can refer to our occupancy resources as well. Assure that the property and its amenities are fully accessible for individuals with disabilities. This may be going into, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act on public spaces. So just knowing that information as well as the fair housing aspect. Ensuring your pathways, curb cuts, entrances are kept clear of obstacles and are safe. Ensure dedicated spaces for accessibility are usable. We often see in snow time that snow is being accumulated in the striped aisles and parking lots, or supplies is being stored in accessible stalls that are in public bathrooms. So just making sure you're not utilizing accessible spaces for things that aren't other than being the accessible use. Next slide. Review advertising material for fair housing implications before publishing or posting. Describe the property, not the people. And again, remember, advertising is not just promotional, but verbal statements as well. And then if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. But a key is when in doubt, take it out. Next slide. When you're applying the application of the laws, make sure you're addressing specific situations armed with knowledge of fair housing. Again, have policies in place and apply them to all. Next slide. These next ones are some scenario-based ones, and I think I'll just do the first two just for sake of time. But this first one, a 65, and we don't have the pools, a 65-year-old male who has rented from you for the 5 years just began using a wheelchair. He's asking that you make a reasonable accommodation for his disability by paying for a ramp so he can have easier access to his first floor unit. What do you do? A, it's a modification, not an accommodation. B, we will have to see if a ramp will fit in the space out front. C, he should use the door off the back. D, how we are funded impacts who pays. E, this is not a reasonable request. And F, I need a letter from a doctor stating he has a disability and disability-related need. I'll give about 30 seconds, 10 seconds here. On people's responses. Okay, in this scenario, what do you do? Choose all that apply. Okay. For sake of time, I am going to move forward. It is a modification, so A is correct. It's a modification, not an accommodation. And then B, you have to see how the ramp will fit, and then sorry, I blocked my letter. D, how we are funded also impacts who pays. So those would be the appropriate responses for that scenario. Next slide. A resident with a rollator works with you to have ramps installed at her door and the common area where other residents and visitors use. She has requested that you maintain both ramps. A, she needs to maintain both ramps herself. B, we will maintain both ramps and charge her a fee to do so. C, she needs to maintain the ramp at her door and we will maintain the one in the common area. And D, neither ramp needs to be maintained. I'll give 10 seconds here for people to get some quick answers. And I know I'm rushing. I just want to make sure that we can get to questions at the end because folks have good questions. Okay, in this scenario, she needs to maintain her ramp, and you will maintain the one in the common area. So C is the most appropriate answer especially if there are other residents that are using it, it would make sense for the housing provider to maintain the common area one and for her to maintain her own. So C. And then apologies, we're not going to be able to get through 3, 4, 5, and 6, but we do have videos on YouTube that go through those. So you're welcome to find those.
Okay, so testing we talked about our work earlier. I did about the education work that we do and also the enforcement work that we do. Housing testing is one facet of the enforcement work that's done at our organization. The testing is an investigative tool used to gather evidence. Volunteer testers simulate ordinary housing transactions for the purpose of obtaining credible and objective information about housing practices. Testing can be used to investigate all types of housing and housing-related services. Measures a difference in quality of information, content of information provided, and quantity of information. So testing often looks at availability, price, terms and conditions, information exchanged, and treatment during housing transactions that are tested. We want to note that there's a clear separation of roles between our enforcement staff and testers. Testers receive a 3-hour training, conduct practice tests, and receive follow-up training. The objective, it's objective rather than subjective. There's no contact between testers, between people who are testing different housing transactions. Testers do not know what is being tested for, and there's side-by-side comparisons. So really what we want to get across is that there's a very clear separation in roles between enforcement staff and testing is really focused on objective information rather than subjective information. This is an example of what housing testing could look like. So 2 testers perhaps go to look at properties with a leasing agent, and the protected characteristics can differ based on what the test is focused on. But just taking down objective information about what agent did they meet with, how long did they meet with the agent, what units were they told were available, is there a wait list, what's the rental rate, security deposit, are there any criminal background checks or income checks or credit checks? And then on the back end, the enforcement testing team is really looking to see if there are differences in how people were treated, how testers were treated in a very objective way. We also want to note the use of the Fair Housing logo. It's available online. Most of you should have received handouts, and Liz has put a link in the chat to handouts a few times. Please use the Fair Housing Equal Housing Opportunity logo. It indicates to the public that the property is available to everyone under the provision of the Fair Housing Act. There are specific requirements for size and location of where these logos need to go on your properties. These are just some links for different things related to MISTA. And then these are some different tools and resources that we have available. We have a ton of resources on our website, so please feel free to check those out. We also have an upcoming event on June 26th. We will have an in-depth review of the 7 federally protected characteristics for rental professionals. This training will not cover state or local laws. So if you attend, be mindful that there are other state or local laws that may apply. A lot of what we covered in today's session will be covered there, but some of it may be a bit more in-depth on those 7 federally protected characteristics. So feel free to register on our website.